Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly. On this episode, I'm joined by outdoorsman Don Thomas. Among many other things, he is the waterfowl editor for Strung magazine. Please join us for our last interview of 2020 as we discuss a life well spent in the field and with the pen. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. It really helps us out. And do you need to find the perfect gift for the hard-to-buy-for fly angler on your list? Blaine Chocolate is offering online classes in January teaching folks how to tie one of his new patterns, the Changer Craw. The first class sold out in just a few days, so Blaine added another one. Space is limited, so don't delay. All the details are in the show notes. Now, on to the interview. Well, Don, welcome to The Articulate Fly.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I appreciate you carving out a little bit of time for me on what I'm sure is a chilly Montana morning.
It is chilly but beautiful. It's crystal clear and not much wind. It's actually just the kind of day I'd like to be outside, and I will be outside later this afternoon and tomorrow. But no worries. I'm happy to spend the morning with you.
Well, I appreciate it, and we have a tradition on The Articulate Fly. We always ask all of our guests to share their earliest fishing memory.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. You know, I suppose, and other people have made this comment with regard to other things about their lives. It's hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't fishing. I kind of came out of the box with a fishing rod in my hand, I guess. I think the anecdote that probably sticks best with me relates to a time back in Massachusetts. I was actually born in Boston, although I haven't been back there in decades. And we lived in a little suburb. My dad was still involved in medicine at Harvard. And there was a little pond near our house called Man's Pond. And actually, I Googled it the other day, apropos of nothing, just to walk down memory lane. And apparently it's still there. A small pond, and I think it had some panfish in it. But, my dad would take me down there sometimes, and we would just fish, bobbers and worms kind of thing. And there was a little creek that came out of the pond, and this creek was 4 feet wide at most. You could walk across it without getting your knees wet. And one day my dad said, "Why don't you go down and see if there's any fish in the creek?" And I did. And again, I was not fly fishing at the time. I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And I got a bite on my worm, and I hauled this fish in, and I looked at it, and I'd never seen anything like it. And I said, "Dad, I think I caught a trout." And he came humping down the bank, and we looked at this thing. I'll never forget those, orange and purple spots. And he was very professorial, and he kind of reared up and said, "Don, you have caught a Salvelinus." I can't believe I can't remember the scientific name for a brook trout now. Fontinalis, Salvelinus fontinalis. And I said, "Well, I thought it was a trout." And he said, "Yeah, that is the proper Latin name for a brook trout." And he said, "This is probably the only brook trout that has ever been caught in this creek." And I was really proud of that fish. And I'll never forget how beautiful it looked once I kind of got the dirt swiped off of it. And of course, there are a few fish in North America or anywhere else that are more beautiful than brook trout.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so when did you get drawn to the dark side of fly fishing?
At an early age, and some of that's relative, of course, but this would be in the 1950s when, fly fishing was kind of an odd thing. It wasn't the scene that it is now, and there are very few resources available. My dad, who had a huge impact on me in many ways, including my development as an outdoor sportsman, grew up very poor in Texas during the Depression. And of course, he didn't know anything about fly fishing. He fished, but he fished for catfish and such because they needed to eat them. So he really didn't know much, but he just decided he was going to be a fly fisherman. And I looked at this and said, "Well, this is kind of neat." So by the time we moved to Cooperstown, New York, which was in the mid 50s when I would have been 6 or 7, he was teaching me to cast a fly. He was not terribly knowledgeable himself. But as soon as I started floating dry flies down streams and watching trout come up to eat them, I was hooked. I started doing more and more fly fishing and less conventional tackle fishing. I guess I didn't become a true purist probably until I was college age. But and when I say purist, I'm not implying any note of snobbery at all. I don't care what other people do, but I don't fish with anything but flies now, no matter what the quarry, whether it's bonefish or halibut, or I fish with everything for flies. And so I can remember standing beside these little streams in upstate New York and casting, royal coachman up into the head of the current and seeing these brook or brown trout come up and smack them. And I was hooked. I was hooked deeper than the fish were.
Well, that's super neat. And, obviously your dad had a big impact on you early on in your fly fishing career, but who are some of the folks that have mentored you along your fly fishing journey, and what have they taught you?
Well, that's interesting because back then in the 50s, there weren't any mentors. It's just so different from the way it is now. There were no fishing shows. Of course, there was no internet. I read some of the general purpose outdoor magazines. I don't think Fly Fisherman hadn't even launched yet. So the resources were limited. We had a copy of Ray Bergman's classic Trout, and I read a lot on that. And in Cooperstown, the man who ran the florist shop was a very accomplished fly tyer. And I would go down and watch him tie flies. I learned a lot from him. I started tying my own flies at a very early age. Again, I was probably 8 or something like that. And every once in a while, when I'm digging through my pile of crap, I find an old fly that I tied, 60 years ago. And it's kind of nice to take one out every once in a while and catch a fish with it. Things weren't very sophisticated then. We had bivisibles and Parmesan bells, but in a lot of ways it was a more innocent time. It just wasn't as well organized or perhaps over organized as it is today.
Got it. And, it's interesting too. There are those of us who are that pre-internet vintage, and it was literally, library books. There were a few magazines. And if you were lucky enough to find somebody in your community that could point you in the right direction.
Yeah. I kept an eye out for opportunities to learn. When we moved to Seattle, of course, we started fishing for steelhead, and I didn't know anything about fly fishing for steelhead. I fished some with conventional tackle for steelhead and actually got quite good at that. But I used to float a section of the Skykomish River in a riverboat very regularly. And there was one angler there who fished with flies. And I never knew his name, but I would politely pull out upstream and watch him, just walk down the bank and watch what he was doing. And he would explain some things to me. That was the first time I ever saw anyone fly fishing for steelhead. And in my own quiet way, I think I learned quite a bit from him. The first thing I learned is that you could actually do it. Because at that time, nobody in Washington fly fished for steelhead. That's not quite true, actually. There was a pediatrician at the University of Washington named Nate Smith, who was one of the real pioneers of steelhead fly fishing in Washington State. And I did know him through medical connections. And he taught me some things too. But, the idea of going down one of those rivers in a drift boat, you might see 100 anglers. None of them would be fly fishing. It just wasn't done then. And I think maybe that's a good illustration of how much the fly fishing world has changed in the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're sort of a universal sportsman, and you're a wing shooting enthusiast. When did wing shooting become a part of your sporting life? It
started early on, for sure. Again, My father is an excellent wing shot, probably the best I've ever seen, and he's also an excellent teacher. And the ability to do something and the ability to teach others how to do it don't always correlate, as you know. But he was a wonderful teacher. And we were living in Cooperstown, New York at the time, a small rural community, home of baseball, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a local skeet range. This was in the days before sporting clays. And we would go out every Sunday and shoot skeet. And by the time I was 7 or 8, I was routinely beating all the men on the skeet range. I don't know. It's just, I didn't have a natural talent in a lot of athletic fields, but I did in this one, combined with a great coach. I got good at it very early, and would roll off 50 straight at the skeet range or something when I was 7 or 8. And I did it with a 12 gauge because we didn't have anything else. And a lot of people say, they say, what's that little kid doing up there with that 12 gauge? Well, that's what we had, and that's what I shot. And I never remember being bothered by recoil, even though I was just a little kid.
When did that translate into from busting clays to busting birds?
We had some fairly good wing shooting there, predominantly for ruffed grouse and woodcock and waterfowl. And my dad was good at that, and I would follow him around for a while. And according to the state of New York, I assume the statute of limitations is expired now. I couldn't hunt until I was 12, and then I could only hunt with an adult. But by the time I was 10, my dad said, look, you're ready. And we would set off with one gun between us, and as soon as we were away from the road, he had the gun. So I guess I was shooting grouse and woodcock about the time I was 10 years old. And interestingly enough, the first day we did that, I killed the first 2 grouse I shot at. And my dad and his friends were kind of kidding me and saying, you ought to quit right now because that'll never happen again. I think it probably took me 3 boxes of shells to shoot my third one, but it was very, very challenging, as you know, if you've done any rough grouse hunting. And I love the upland hunting. I really love the duck hunting. And our duck hunting wasn't very good by the standards I've enjoyed since then. But I was just fascinated by the fact that you could sit next to a beaver pond and, maybe some teal or a black duck would come in. We also had a great gun dog then, and that really influenced my life in a lot of ways. My dad grew up with dogs, but they were hounds. And he'd never had a bird dog before, and a friend of his raised short hairs, and he he had a litter, and there was this sort of run at the litter that he gave us, which, and interestingly, that dog went on to beat his dogs in field trials regularly. The dog was just spectacular at everything, both pointing and retrieving. And, as I got a little bit older and we lived out in the country, I would just take off with that dog. His name was Fitz, and, walk around the woodlots and so on, shooting grouse and woodcock. And it was great. Those were great times. It's funny, when you're a kid, you don't need, anything can be an adventure. And I compare those hunting experiences to what I've enjoyed as an adult in Montana and Alaska. They weren't world class by any means, but boy, when you're a kid and you've got a good dog and good companionship and a good teacher, it doesn't get any better than that. I don't think I've ever enjoyed hunting more than I did then.
Yeah, that's really neat. So it sounds like dogs were really kind of always a part of your life then.
Yes, they were. And of course they are now, and I'm sure you're aware of that. I've basically always had a gun dog or two of one type or another. I enjoy dogs. I enjoy training them. I enjoy their company. And I've never sent a dog to a trainer, not because I think I know everything that a professional trainer knows, but because in most areas of the outdoors, I would rather do it myself, make my own mistakes, and learn from them rather than having somebody else do it for me. And I've learned some things about training dogs over the years. I don't pretend to be a professional expert, but when you've had as many dogs as I have and spent as much time walking around the field with them, you're bound to learn something about the subject.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you have a favorite breed?
I have had. I'm trying to run through the list here over the years. Short hairs, wire hairs, English pointers, Brittany's, labs, and when I was hunting cougars here, I had blue ticks and treeing walkers. I mean, I've had just about every sporting breed of dog you have. Well, I guess I asked to name a favorite, and I've had some excellent dogs from all of those breeds. Right now, I have 2 labs and 2 German wire hairs, and I love both those breeds. And I will probably not have a dog from another breed besides those 2 in the remainder of my life. I'm very, very happy with my kennel right now.
Got it. And do you have a favorite wing shooting quarry?
That's a really interesting story. Yes, I have a couple. And I think the reason I like them is because they're challenging and difficult, and also because they offer good opportunities for a dog to showcase its talents. I enjoy hunting chukar, which I did a lot of when I was growing up in Washington. And I enjoy hunting Mearns quail in the desert Southwest. And the 2 have some things in common. The terrain is rugged, so you have to stay in shape, which is getting harder and harder as I get older and older. And the shooting is difficult because of erratic flight patterns and, in the case of Mearns quail, obstructions. People don't think of that, but Mearns quail live in live oak habitat, and it's a lot like hunting rough grouse, except the hills are a lot steeper. So if I had to name 2, I'd name those 2. I also enjoy ptarmigan just because I love the places where ptarmigan live. They're not the most challenging bird on the wing, but almost everywhere where I've ever hunted ptarmigan has been a spectacular wild corner of Alaska, and I just love the terrain and the habitat.
Yeah, and you've got a great article. I guess it won't be the most recent article soon, but it's in the most recent Upland article of Strung about your quail hunting in Arizona.
Yes, I do remember that. Well, it's very interesting. Montana winters can be brutal, although I've never had a problem with winter. And some years ago, a friend of mine who was a friend from Alaska actually wound up spending his winters in southern Arizona. And he asked me to come down and hunt quail with him. He's an excellent hunter, and an excellent dog. And I enjoyed that so much that we wound up buying a house in southern Arizona. And so we would spend, from about now until early April down there. And, you can't really get good at any one thing in the outdoors unless you live where it takes place. There's just a qualitative increase in your knowledge base when you're actually doing something every day and seeing the game and the terrain under a whole variety of conditions. And I really got absorbed by Mearns quail hunting. And then the Mearns quail numbers started crashing, which they have done before, and nobody's sure quite why. The hunting wasn't nearly as good, and there was a big mine going in next to the little town where we lived. That was kind of changing the character of the town, so we wound up selling that place. Although I probably will get back down there for a couple of weeks every winter still, just because I love the Mearns quail hunting so much. And they're a great, great quarry for a pointing dog. If you don't have a good dog, you're probably not even going to see one, let alone shoot it. And when you've got a dog that's had some experience with Mearns quail, it's really a delight to hunt with them.
Yeah, it's funny, too, because I remember from that article, you were expressing your reluctance to go to GPS trackers on your dogs and that you were a brass bell guy. And I think that's kind of an overarching thing for you. You're very traditionalist on the gear front. Where did that come from?
Well, I think that's kind of a complex question. I think I would circle back to the bow hunting world. my dad was not a bow hunter, so I didn't really do much bow hunting when I was a kid, but I was always fascinated by bows and arrows. And I would go make my own bows, out of a piece of string and a sapling. So I was always interested in archery. And then about the time we moved to Montana in the early 1970s, uh, there were a lot of good bow hunting opportunities here, and I started to pick it up. And bow hunting is a corner of the outdoors where technology has really, really impacted the fundamental nature of the sport. For years, if you go back and read the works of the early pioneers in American bow hunting revival, from Fred Bear to Pope and Young and Pearson and all these people, they were all hunting with traditional bows, either recurves or longbows. And then the compound bow came along sometime in the 60s, and that sort of heralded this huge change in the amount of technology that came to bear in bow hunting. And all of a sudden, people had range finders, they had sights on their bows, and all kinds of things. A modern compound really bears very little resemblance to a traditional bow. And I realized that, I couldn't shoot at the distances that a good compound shooter could shoot, but I didn't want to, because the challenge of bow hunting to me has always been about getting close to a very big game animal. So I hunt exclusively with longbows and recurves, and that's become kind of an issue, I suppose, in the bow hunting community now. Those of us who call ourselves traditional bow hunters, I think, we can get a little snobbish sometimes, but I still feel that that's where bow hunting really lies. And you can translate that basic issue to other areas of the outdoors as well. Certainly, the fly rods that we use now are not the fly rods I was using in the 1950s. Although I have to admit, I don't fish with bamboo much. I have one bamboo rod, but I tend to fish with graphite. But I don't think I could have done what I do in salt water now with the fiberglass rods that I was fishing with as a kid. Wing shooting, maybe not so much. The collars on the dogs is an interesting thing. Cougar hunting can be either really admirable or really not admirable. And, the way it's done so often, particularly on guided hunts here in Montana, is the guide and the client sit in the cafe and drink coffee while he's got kids running up the back roads looking for tracks. And they find a track, they turn the dog loose. The dog has a collar that will not only give its location, but can actually tell when the cat is treed. When the dog goes from horizontal to vertical, that changes the tone on the receiver. So the dog is treed. You can get out your digital map, see exactly where it is, see the best way to get there, drive in a snow machine and shoot the cat. And you can kill a cat that way without knowing anything about mountain lions, without doing any of the aspects of mountain lion hunting that appealed to me, which was, number one, staying in shape over the winter, because a lion chase can turn into a real marathon very easily. And you became a tracker. You had to, because that's the way you kept track of literally what the cat and the dogs were doing. So I kind of balked at locator collars back then for that reason. I do use simple locator collars some on my pointing dogs when we're hunting heavy cover, just so I can keep some idea. I never even graduated to the GPS type dog collar, just something that beeps so I can hear them and tell where they are. I guess you can draw these lines in a lot of different places and in a lot of different ways. And I'm not pretending that the way I drew them is the way everybody should draw them. But I have been aware of the potential impacts of too much technology on basically all aspects of outdoor hunting and fishing.
Yeah, it certainly, I guess easiest and hardest way to say it is it changes our relationship to the outdoor world pretty dramatically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, in the hunting world, I mean, I enjoy going and shooting a limit of sharp tails or shooting a big elk with my bow. But honestly, the killing the animal really is of secondary importance to me. I look at a bow or a shotgun or a fly rod basically as an excuse to be outdoors and learning. I try to learn something every time I'm walking in the woods, about the animals, what they're doing, the habitat. I enjoy all aspects of natural history. I've had a life list of birds since I was 3 years old, and so on and so on. I mean, I'm just always looking at things out there. And if you take away the challenge of needing to do that, for me, you've taken away a lot of the motivation for hunting in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say that. It reminds me I'm incredibly fond of fishing the fire hole in the fall. And to me, it's this, you're literally watching the world go to sleep. And,
Yep.
The snow is falling if you're there in September and October, and you've got the bison migrations. And, it's not that the fish are huge, but there's something very relaxing about swinging soft hackles, waiting for the miller caddis or the blue-winged olive hatch, during the day.
Yeah, and that's a classical example. I mean, when you're standing in the fire hole, you are in the fire hole. There's no place else you could be. You can take one flash exposure of whatever you're looking at and know you were standing in the fire hole. And fall is definitely the time to do Yellowstone because most of the tourists are gone. Interestingly enough, despite all the time I've spent with dangerous wild animals, I've only really almost gotten in trouble twice. And one of them, believe it or not, was a cow elk on the fire hole. And our son had just been born, and my first wife and I were there and fishing the fire hole kind of casually. And I noticed this elk 300 yards downstream across the river, and I could tell she had a young calf with her. And, I made note of it. I didn't go down that way. And the next thing I knew, this elk was sloshing across the river. Again, this is 300 yards away. And she winds up in my face, charging me with hooves flailing and all kinds of things. And we had this newborn baby with us. Fortunately, I had one of my labs with us on a leash. And don't tell the Park Service, but I told my wife, let the dog off the leash or we're going to have trouble with this baby. And so there I was in the fire hole, all the dangerous places I've been, almost getting stomped by a cow elk. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens when you least expect it. And, one of the interesting things, right, is given your breadth of sporting experience, I feel pretty comfortable there's a pretty definite seasonal arc to your sporting life. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's complicated. At one time I sat down and figured that I actually have killed a big game animal with a bow at all 12 months of the year. And of course, it's not just about bow hunting. I wrote a book once called To All Things a Season, which was basically answering just the question you've asked. I started in January and went right through the year, just kind of chronicling and, not in hard, boring facts, but the feel of what I was doing during every month of the year. Actually, that was one of my favorite books. But in January, there's still some waterfowl hunting available, which can be very good here in Montana when everything else freezes hard. Some of these little spring-fed sloughs stay open. As a matter of fact, that's what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. And in the Pacific Flyway, where I still do a lot of duck hunting because of some property I inherited from my family, the season runs almost to the end of January. And when I lived in Alaska, we would always make a trip to Kodiak in January to hunt ducks and hunt black-tailed deer and put some halibut in the freezer. So that was January. February is kind of a tough one. Although now I usually go to Hawaii. We traded our Arizona place for a place in Hawaii, and I can hunt axis deer and fish the ocean there in February and March. April is turkey time. I love hunting spring turkeys with my bow. It's very, very challenging, as you can imagine. I have a lot of turkeys actually laying around our house. So I usually spend most of April hunting turkeys. May traditionally was time to hunt spring bear in Alaska, and here in Montana to some degree, although the bear hunting was a lot better in Alaska. And of course, by May, hatches are starting, and before the first little pulse of runoff, what we call the lowland runoff, before that clouds up the water, fly fishing for trout right around our home can be very, very good in late April and May. And by June, I'm either fly fishing locally. I almost always go back to Alaska in June to fish for king salmon with friends. And for years, I went to Africa almost every summer. I did that, 14, 15 times, which is a wonderful experience in its own. And then the season for sharp-tailed grouse and Hungarian partridge opens on September 1st in Montana. So all of a sudden I'm back to wing shooting again, and that sort of consumes me for the next several months. Pheasant season usually opens in October. Archery season opens in September, and that used to be the time when the elk were bugling, and I'd spent a lot of time bow hunting elk. I haven't done as much of that in the last few years for a variety of reasons. But September is a very busy month here, and the fishing is excellent too in September. So I've always said I wish there were 12 Septembers every year. And by November, the whitetail rut is starting, which is a magical time to be in the woods with a bow. Upland hunting is still good. Seasons run all the way through the end of December in Montana. And then December, mountain lion season usually opens on the 1st of December. And I don't have hounds anymore. I've gotten away for that. But for years, that was a way that I stayed occupied during the winter months. So that's a lot. That's
a lot
of time outdoors,
Yeah, absolutely. And, I suspect you still want to hunt and fish more like so many of us. And, you've been really fortunate to balance your medical career with your outdoor life. And, I know so many people that are trying to kind of get their professional life to dovetail with what they want to do outdoors. Do you have any suggestions or any tips for people about how to think about or do things?
I get asked about that a lot because, at one point I was really a prolific writer. I had 20 books at some point. I'm sort of out of that now. But I think the first thing is to organize your priorities. And particularly when you're in a profession like medicine, money can be a temptation. Money was not going to be a motivator for me. As long as I had enough money to buy shotgun shells and arrows, I was happy. And I'm fortunate enough now to be married to a woman who shares that point of view. And because I wasn't really cared much about money, I could kind of go wherever I wanted to, which is how I got to live in rural Montana and Alaska for all these years. And there's no substitute for living right next to what it is that you want to be doing in the outdoors. And, I've had a lot of other physicians and other professional people ask me, well, how did you do that? How do you do that? And I sort of just do it. Allen Ginsberg, the poet, was undergoing analysis by a psychiatrist in San Francisco, and this would have been in the 1950s. And Ginsberg was very conflicted at that time, and he told his psychiatrist, all I really want to do is I just want to write poetry. And his psychiatrist said to him, Allen, why don't you do that? It's an amazingly simple solution to the problem. If you decide that's what you want to do, you can do it. You can't simultaneously rise to the top of a complicated profession and become an accomplished outdoorsman, but it's not that hard to find a balance between the two. And I enjoyed the practice of medicine. I mean, I took it very seriously. I worked a lot harder at it than a lot of young physicians do today because things are set up differently now. But it can be done. You just need to organize your priorities. And I suppose if I'd organized my priorities differently, I'd be a lot wealthier and maybe have some academic standing in medicine. But I just decided I was more interested in other things.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And speaking of Allen Ginsberg and writers, you're an absolutely prolific writer. When did you get the writing bug?
Well, that's interesting. I always sort of enjoyed writing. I mean, all the way back to high school and so on. And some teachers encouraged me a lot. My undergraduate degree is actually in English from Berkeley, even though I went on to medical school. And I always sort of nibbled around the edges of it, wrote letters to the editor and things like that. And in early 1980s, I wrote my first magazine article and submitted it to Bowhunter magazine. It was an article about caribou hunting with a bow. And M.R. James took it and encouraged me some more. And then I realized that I did a lot of things in the outdoors besides bow hunting. So I started branching out and started writing about dogs and fly fishing and wing shooting and everything else. And by the early 90s, I was doing 60 or 70 features a year and writing books. I think my first books came out in 1992, I believe. The first one was called Longbows in the Far North. It's published by Stackpole. And it sold a lot for a hunting book. I mean, I sold 10,000 copies or something before it went out of print. And I found that I enjoyed writing books, and I enjoyed writing magazine articles. I have a lot of friends who are writers, It's funny, we're all kind of like a bunch of little old ladies. We all know everybody's business. And some of my writing friends, frankly, find it difficult. It's work. They have to grind out every word. And it's kind of like pulling teeth to get a 2,000-word article done. It's just never been that way for me. I enjoy the English language. I still read avidly. And there's nothing I'd rather do than develop a good story in my head and sit down and translate those ideas onto the printed page. I just find that to be extremely enjoyable.
Yeah. And so do you like to write a little bit every day, or do you just kind of, once you've kind of got that framework in your mind, you sit down and knock it out?
I do a lot of writing in my head when I'm out hunting and fishing. I'm always thinking about how could I tell this story in a fresh, new way. I mean, I'm not much of a 10 hot tips to help you bag your buck this year. I don't do a lot of that. So I'm always kind of compiling things in my head, and I'm pretty disciplined. I write almost every morning for an hour or two, more like 2 if I've got a book project going. But it's just part of my day. I don't write at all out in the field. I don't even take notes. Sometimes I'll scroll down a name or some specific thing like that, but it's all sort of going on between my ears all the time I'm outside. And I find it really not all that difficult to get the mental picture onto the computer. I don't know what people did before computers. Well, I did.
Because you did it.
Yeah, I did it. I don't know how I did it. I don't know how I did books before computers. Oh, my God. What a hassle that would be. I wouldn't say, it's not like I look at a clock and say, okay, I'm going to write from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, but I write almost every day, almost always in the morning, first cup of coffee, have a bagel, do the New York Times crossword puzzle, and then write for a couple of hours. And it just sort of helps glue my day together.
Yeah. And do you have certain authors that you like to read and follow, or do you just kind of do your own thing?
Well, I read a lot, and I guess that goes back to my days of English at Berkeley. Curiously enough, I don't read a lot of the outdoor stuff because I'm immersed in it all the time. And for my recreational reading, I mean, I'm more likely to read Shakespeare. I mean, I reread Homer every year, and I'm not trying to sound like a snob. I do read contemporary fiction. In the outdoor field, a lot of outdoor writing isn't very good. There are some people who do it very well, and I admire them. I like Tom McGuane is just excellent. And there are others, some younger people like Reed Bryant. And when I see one of their names in a magazine, I read it. I don't read every magazine. I read traditional Bowhunter cover to cover because I have to edit it. Everything between the covers is passed before my eyes before it goes to press. But speaking of Strung, I felt an accomplishment in my own career was when I finally got a story published at Gray's, and I've written regularly for Gray's for years now. And I think Gray's always sort of set the standard for the outdoor writing. I'll call it that for want of a better term. And then especially in the internet age, I really began to get worried because everything seemed to be based on Facebook and YouTube and digital media, and the craft of writing about the outdoors seemed to be kind of fading away. And we have a great tradition of that in America. I mean, Hemingway's an obvious example. Faulkner wrote amazing hunting stories, and there were certainly many others along the way, and they were good writers. And I sort of saw that end of things getting edged out with more and more emphasis on trophy hunting and more and more emphasis on how to, as opposed to this is what it felt like when I was there. So I was absolutely delighted when I saw Strung and Tail for the first time, because it seemed to me that these magazines were headed in the same general direction that Gray's had been for 50 years. As a matter of fact, it's Gray's 50th anniversary this year, and I got to get off my butt and write something for them. So that was a real breath of fresh air. I'm involved in the magazine business enough with traditional bowhunter to know all too well the problems that print magazines are facing now. And I just hope that we can keep it together, because the tradition of writing about the outdoors is so important, particularly here in America. It would just be a shame to lose that to tweets and Twitters and all that stuff, which isn't writing, I don't know what it is, but so I sort of imagine, Marvin, that you share that concern.
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's a place for everything. I think, and so, I'm not against any of it. It's just, I think, sometimes at least for, I guess, people with a little bit more of a more traditional perspective, the new tools don't work as well to tell the story.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so kind of jumping a little bit beyond kind of the, I guess, the outdoor writing piece of the puzzle, you've been in the field for quite a few years. What changes have you seen, to the industry, and, what are your thoughts and concerns about the future of outdoor sports and our sporting traditions?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, from a purely practical standpoint, one of the big changes is that there isn't any money there anymore. I get paid less now for a feature article than I did in 1980, because advertising appears to be so much more efficient and economically feasible online than through print magazines. And the print magazines just aren't getting the advertiser support that they once had. And I don't really care. I mean, yeah, it's a significant source of income for me, but I won't starve to death if I never write again or never write about the outdoors again. But I think it's making it less appealing to younger people who, for whom payments for writing may be more important in terms of their day-to-day family budget. I think I alluded to this earlier, but I see just a lot more attention being paid, particularly in the area of big game hunting, to trophies. And you can define a trophy in a number of ways. They've been around, well, since the beginning of Western literature in the Iliad. But I have always tried to de-emphasize that. And I try to de-emphasize that when I'm editing traditional bow hunter. And hunters come off a whole lot better in the court of public opinion, and you certainly know this, when they're seen as being hunting for meat as opposed to hunting for horns. And I've shot a lot of big animals, and that was enjoyable. I don't have a blanket condemnation of that, but I think it's important to establish that that's not the only reason to be there. And interestingly, one of the bits of good news in the hunter recruitment story is that we've now become a nation of foodies. And there's a lot of young people who are really interested in eating wild game. And again, I always try to emphasize that aspect of the hunting in the material that I edit and in the material I write. And I think the idea of eating wild, natural, organic meat, not that I have anything against my many friends in the livestock industry, but that's drawing a lot of people into the hunting circle that I don't think would have been there 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see that, with people like April Vokey and others trying to kind of, and I think it's also maybe a little bit part of this kind of growth and kind of the maker movement as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so, I know you've written, I think, over 20 books. I know you're the waterfowl editor of Strung. You're the editor of Traditional Bow Hunter?
Traditional Bow Hunter, yeah.
Yeah. And so what's the best place if people want to follow your writing to kind of keep track of you?
Well, Traditional Bow Hunter, certainly. Now, that has a fairly narrow focus, but not nearly as narrow as it sounds. It's not all just one dead deer after another. We talk, a lot of our material involves wilderness survival skills. We have a regular wild cuisine column now. We have a regular hunting history column. So that magazine is not nearly as tightly focused as one might think. And I like to think that we have some good contributors now. And I like to think that the quality is there, but certainly the emphasis is a little bit different than it is in a lot of the mainstream big game hunting. I still write regularly for Gray's, and I love their editorial standards, and will always enjoy writing for Gray's. I write a lot for Village Press, which is Steve Smith and now his son Jake, which do Retriever Journal, Pointing Dog Journal, and just Labs, among other things. And I write regularly for them. I have some, I think I'm a field editor or something like that for Retriever Journal. Regionally, Big Sky Journal, published here in Bozeman, has become excellent. Montana probably has the highest per capita rate or prevalence of talented outdoor photographers and writers, any state in the country. And it's quarterly publication, very high standards. I do a lot for them. I used to do a lot of writing about Alaska, but I kind of got disenchanted with Alaska Magazine. No need to go into the details here, but so I've sort of stopped writing for them. Shooting Sportsman, which is an excellent wing shooting magazine. Those are sort of my regulars, I guess.
Yeah.
I haven't done a book in several years. Books are a lot of work, and it was fun for a while. Frankly, I sort of feel like I've said what I have to say on that front. I missed a really good opportunity, and this was just my fault. I really should have done a book on my father and his career and the Nobel Prize and all of that stuff, because it's a fascinating story, and it would have had some outdoor material in it, just because that's one of the things he did. And he died several years ago, and I just didn't get around to sitting down with a tape recorder and spending a couple of weeks talking to him. That would have been a very good book. Outdoor writers usually don't tend to get much attention unless they're doing something outside of the outdoor field. Tom McGuane's a good example. And I love writing fiction, and I do. I write. Unfortunately, I have limited output or outlets for it. I do write fiction for Gray's, and I love writing fiction. And part of the problem is I'm old. If I was 25 now, I'd be pounding the streets of New York and talking to agents. I'm just too old, too tired. I don't want to do that. I wish I had more good outlets for fiction, because I love writing it. And at least some people think some of what I write is good. And who knows, I may tackle some big project yet before I die. I've got a few years left on the odometer, I think.
Yeah, I suspect you have some tread left on the tires.
Yeah, a little bit. Oh, it's been a rough few years. I had to have a brain tumor removed last year, and I've had surgery on my neck and surgery on my shoulder. I've reached the age parts are starting to wear out, but I'm still going.
Well, that's the important thing for sure.
Yes, it is. And that requires some mental effort at my age. A couple of good friends who I've hunted and fished with for years, we're all going through this. We just can't run up the mountain anymore. We can go up, but we've got to go a lot more slowly and think a lot more carefully about our survival and our ability to get ourselves out of rough situations. Oh gosh, we're just not young anymore, Marvin.
Yeah, but I also think it counsels to the advice that you gave, which is if it's important to you, you should do it. Because if you wait, until you're 65 or 70 and retired, you may not be able to do the things that you really wanted to do.
You're absolutely right. And over the years, I've been fortunate enough to get in on the ground floor exploratory aspects of a number of fascinating bits of hunting. 1990 and 1991, I was in the Soviet Far East as the Soviet Union was literally falling apart all around us, hunting brown bears with bows and doing things like that. And then I got involved in guiding bow hunters for buffalo in Australia, northern Australia. Tremendous wilderness, pure wilderness experiences, both of those were. And people would always say, boy, I want to do that. Yeah. Well, I said, well, then sign you up. I'll take you next year. Well, next year my kid's in the football team. And, one thing after another. And you can't do those things now for various reasons. The window was open and then it closed. And anytime you get in the business of saying, well, yeah, I'll do that in a few years. That's something that's on my bucket list. I'll do it before I die. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work, because a lot of the really special outdoor opportunities have a very limited lifespan. And if you see a good one, put it on your bucket list, but get it done within the next year or so,
Yeah, I was just getting ready to say, and Don, before I let you go, I know you're not a big social media guy, but I was right. And I heard your interview with Hal Herring at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and I certainly, I would call you not a Luddite, which is I think what you wanted to call yourself. I would just say you're judicious. But if folks want to kind of keep track of what you're doing in the field and getting in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, email is my preferred means of communication. I hate talking on the phone. I think that's because of all those years when I was a physician and I was the only internist in the places I worked, and when somebody was really sick, when that phone rang, I canceled whatever I was going to do for the next week. So I have kind of a visceral aversion to phones. My email address is thomasdon@me.com. That's mikeecho.com. And when people write me, I write back. My position has always been, if somebody is interested enough to drop me a note about something, sometimes it's for advice, sometimes it's just wanting to visit about some aspect of the outdoors. So that's the best way to get a hold of me. And Lori is moderately active on social media. Lori is my wife, without whom I could not be doing all of the things we've discussed. And so you can look for Lori on social media, and she'll get it to me. And maybe someday I will break down and acknowledge that I need to do some social media. And I hate to be cynical, but gosh, I just see so many people wasting so much time on Facebook. And again, I resent the fact that social media are taking over what the writing aspect of portraying life in the outdoors, because I think the writing is important, and you're not going to write anything great on Facebook. It's just not the way the medium works. So to answer your question, anybody's welcome to drop me an email at any time, and you can also get a hold of me through the editors of any of those magazines I mentioned. And, they all have websites with readily available contact information. And I hear from a lot of people that way. Editors are reluctant to give out my information, which is just courtesy, but if they hear from somebody, they'll send me the note, and I respond. As I said, I think if somebody is interested enough to try to communicate with me, I'm not going to ignore it.
Well, listen, Don, I appreciate you having a cup of coffee or two with me this chilly Montana morning.
It's just beautiful outdoors right now. I'm looking out my window. There's deer walking along the edge of the forest, but they're safe for this year.
Well, Don, thanks again so much for taking the time to chat with me.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Happy holidays. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Again, if you like the podcast, please tell a friend, and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, everybody.